You know, going through this material, it's really gotten me thinking about some pretty fundamental stuff, like how we come together as societies and what we owe each other. Really puts you in a philosophical frame of mind.
Absolutely. And I think at the heart of a lot of that is this idea of public goods.
Hmm.
These excerpts you shared from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, they really delve into this concept. And it's something that thinkers like John Stuart Mill, were already grappling with centuries ago.
It's one of those ideas that just keeps coming up, right? Like it's
Mm,
so fundamental to how we live together.
exactly.
So, for everyone listening today, we're going to try to unpack this whole idea of public goods, kind of like we're all philosophers sitting around a table.
Mm.
We want to go beyond just a simple definition and explore the why, the ethical puzzles, the real world dilemmas that make it so relevant.
Yeah, I think that's a great approach.
All right, so to kick things off, maybe we can start with the core economic definition. How does the encyclopedia define a public good?
Okay. So at its heart, a public good is defined by two key characteristics. The first is non-rivalry.
Non rivalry.
Right. And what that means is that one person's consumption or enjoyment of the good doesn't diminish another person's ability to also enjoy it.
Okay, I get that.
So, like, think of a symphony performance. Your enjoyment of the music doesn't prevent anyone else from also enjoying the music.
Right. It's not like a slice of cake where if I take a piece, there's less for
It's
you.
exactly. It's not a zero-sum game.
So that's non-rivalry. What's the other key characteristic?
The second one is non-excludability.
Non-excludability.
And that essentially means that it's either very difficult or practically impossible to prevent people from benefiting from the good, even if they haven't contributed to providing it.
Okay, I see.
A classic example here is a lighthouse.
Ah, the lighthouse, the
Yeah.
textbook example.
Right. All ships in the vicinity benefit from the light it provides, regardless of whether they paid for its upkeep or construction.
And it's these two features, non-rivalry and non-excludability, that make public goods so interesting philosophically.
Absolutely. I mean, their very existence raises these profound questions about how we balance collective well-being with individual responsibility.
Mm.
It's like, who should be responsible for making sure these things exist if everyone benefits, regardless of their contribution?
Yeah. It really gets to the heart of how we structure society, doesn't it? And the encyclopedia actually dives into the history of this thinking, too. It mentions figures like John Stuart Mill, Ugo Mazzola, and Wixell.
Yeah, those are some heavy hitters.
It's really fascinating to see how these early philosophical and economic minds began to try to formalize these ideas. It's like they laid the groundwork for our modern understanding of public goods.
Right. And what's interesting is that while the definition seems clear-cut on the surface, there are these really fascinating gray areas. The encyclopedia even talks about the porous boundaries of what constitutes a public good.
Porous boundaries, huh?
Yeah, like it's not always so straightforward. For example, whether something is truly rivalrous can depend on the context or even on individual preferences. They give this example of a movie theater. On the surface, watching a film seems non-rivalrous. My enjoyment doesn't stop you from enjoying it. But then, what if the person next to you is, like, constantly on their phone, the bright screen shining in your face? Or they're talking loudly throughout the film?
Yeah, all of a sudden your enjoyment of the film is definitely diminished.
Exactly. So the nature of the good itself isn't the only factor.
Right. It can depend on external factors or even subjective experiences.
Absolutely. And then excludability also isn't always a fixed thing. Like radio broadcasts were once a textbook example of a public good because it was nearly impossible to stop people from tuning in. But with digital technology, subscriptions and paywalls, that's not always the case anymore.
Right. Technology can change the rules of the game.
Yeah, for sure. And it's not just technology either. Our shared societal agreements play a huge role. Things like property rights enforced by legal systems, that's what often determines excludability.
Yeah.
The fence around someone's property isn't just a physical barrier. It represents a whole set of laws and norms that prevent others from just walking in.
Right.
But even those rights are, shaped by the norms we collectively accept. The encyclopedia actually uses a pretty funny example to illustrate this. Socks with sandals.
Oh, yeah. Laughing. That's a good one.
It's like, it's not a law that says you can't wear socks with sandals,
Mhm.
but it's our shared social disapproval that mostly excludes it from being widely accepted.
I mean, it's true. It's a social norm, not a legal one. So we're seeing that this idea of public goods is not a simple yes or no kind of thing. There are different scales and types as well. The encyclopedia talks about local, national, and global public goods. What's the distinction there?
Yeah, that's a really important point, especially when we start thinking about who is responsible for providing these goods and who benefits. A local public good, like a community park, primarily benefits those in the immediate vicinity. National defense, on the other hand, is meant to protect everyone within a country's borders.
Makes sense.
And then you have global public goods, things like efforts to combat climate change, which ideally benefit all of humanity. Of course, those raise really complex questions about international cooperation and shared responsibility.
Right, like how do you get everyone to contribute to something that benefits everyone when there's no one in charge globally to enforce it?
Exactly. It's a huge challenge.
The encyclopedia also draws a distinction between partial and full public goods. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, and they use this great example from Ankur Olson, a parade.
A parade. Okay, I'm curious how that fits in.
So imagine a parade going through a city. For people who have a clear view from their apartment windows, it's a non-excludable and non-rivalrous good. They can enjoy the parade without paying or preventing anyone else from doing so. But for someone who wants a guaranteed spot in the stands, they might have to buy a ticket, right? So their access becomes excludable to some extent and even potentially rivalrous if the stands get crowded.
So the same event, the parade, can have different public good characteristics depending on how you're experiencing it.
Exactly. It's a good example of how these concepts can play out in really nuanced ways.
Okay, so let's get into some more specific examples and really dig into their philosophical implications. We've got things like security, national defense, police services that seem like core public goods.
Absolutely.
It's hard to imagine excluding anyone within a protected area from the benefits of security, and one person's safety doesn't typically come at the expense of another's. So, from a philosophical perspective, what kind of questions does this raise?
Well, I think one of the big ones is the very legitimacy and scope of state power. If everyone benefits from this protection and no one can easily be denied it, then there's a strong argument to be made that it should be collectively provided and funded through the state. It also raises questions about the social contract, like what are our obligations as individuals to a state that provides this fundamental security?
It makes you think about what we give up in exchange for that security.
Yeah, the trade-offs.
What about education and scientific research? The encyclopedia says that's a bit more nuanced, like obviously an individual's degree is a private good, but the overall benefit of an educated population seems to fit the public goods model.
I think that's right. Knowledge itself, or scientific discoveries, at their core, they're largely non-rivalrous and very difficult to exclude. Once a scientific principle is discovered, it's hard to stop others from learning it and using it. Although, obviously, patents and things like that introduce some temporary excludability.
Right. It's more about the practical applications than the knowledge itself.
Exactly. And having a more educated population generally leads to all sorts of benefits that are widely shared. A more informed citizenry, more productive economy, more innovation.
It's like a rising tide lifts all boats kind of thing.
Yeah. So from a philosophical perspective, this leads to questions about public funding for education and research. Is there an ethical obligation to make knowledge accessible to everyone?
And how do you balance individual rights with the potential societal benefits of widespread access to knowledge?
Right. There are definitely trade-offs to consider.
Okay, what about infrastructure? Things like roads, lighthouses, the internet. The encyclopedia points out that their public goods character can really vary.
Yeah. I mean, think about the classic example of the lighthouse. We always use it as an example of public good, but historically, a lot of lighthouses were actually privately funded through fees on ships.
Interesting. So private interests could see the value in providing something that had public benefits.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this raises a bigger philosophical question. Does government provision of certain goods actually stifle private innovation? Could there be more efficient solutions out there if we let the market work it out, even for things that seem inherently public?
Yeah. It's a question of whether the government is always the best solution or if private initiatives can step in sometimes.
Right. I mean, it's not always a clear-cut answer.
Definitely. The encyclopedia also talks about the environment. Clean air, the absence of litter, those feel pretty non-excludable and non-rivalrous. So what ethical responsibilities do we have there?
I think the very fact that a healthy environment benefits everyone so broadly, and that one person's enjoyment of it doesn't take away from anyone else's, really underscores our collective ethical responsibility.
Right. It's like a shared resource that we all have a stake in.
Exactly. And philosophically, the challenge is that it runs right into that free rider problem. Why should I make sacrifices to reduce my impact if other people aren't doing the same? Why should I bother if it doesn't make a difference?
Especially when it comes to something as massive and complex as the environment, it can feel like individual actions don't really matter.
Right. Which is why collective action and a sense of shared responsibility are so crucial.
Okay, last example from the list. Public health. The encyclopedia explains how a healthy population creates benefits that are non-excludable and non-rivalrous. Like fewer contagious diseases benefit everyone. So what are the philosophical justifications for taking collective action on things like healthcare?
Well, I think the idea that a healthy population creates benefits that are widely shared really provides a strong foundation for thinking about healthcare as a collective good. It's not just about individual well-being, it's about the overall health and resilience of society.
So it's in everyone's self-interest to have a healthy population.
Exactly. And this naturally leads to philosophical discussions about whether healthcare should be seen as more of a public right or a private commodity.
Right. There's that tension between individual responsibility and collective well-being again. Now, the encyclopedia also brings up Angela Kollhoff's alternative definition of public goods, focusing on the basic availability condition and the open access condition. How does that change things?
Well, I think Kollhoff's definition really shifts our focus from the technical characteristics of the goods themselves to the ethical principles that should guide their distribution. The basic availability condition emphasizes that everyone should have access to a similar level and type of benefit, regardless of their ability to pay or other factors. And the open access condition stresses the absence of unfair or arbitrary exclusionary criteria.
So it's not just about whether a good is technically non-excludable, it's about whether it's truly accessible to everyone in a fair and equitable way.
Exactly. And that really brings in a whole set of ethical considerations that go beyond just the economic definition of a public good.
Right. It's about ensuring that these goods actually serve the common good in a meaningful way. So we've talked about what public goods are, some of the philosophical questions they raise, but we haven't really gotten into the challenges of actually providing them. The encyclopedia spends a good chunk of time on what it calls the public goods problem.
Right. And this is where things get really tricky, both practically and ethically. The public goods problem arises precisely because of that non-excludable nature we talked about earlier. It creates a strong incentive for individuals to become free riders, to enjoy the benefits without having to contribute to the cost.
I see.
Like, why pay for something if you can get it for free, right?
Yeah, from a purely individualistic perspective, it makes sense.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it can lead to a situation where the good never gets provided at all because no one is willing to step up and cover the costs.
Right, everyone's waiting for someone else to do it.
And this is tied to the concept of positive externalities. Like when the provision of a public good generates benefits for people who didn't even contribute to its creation or funding.
Yeah, that seems like a pretty common scenario.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the encyclopedia uses this really helpful illustration with Bob and Sally investing in a radio station.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. Can you walk us through that?
Okay, so imagine Bob and Sally each have the option of contributing money to fund a local radio station. If the total contributions exceed the cost of setting it up, then the station gets built, and both of them can listen, regardless of who contributed what.
Okay, I'm following.
So philosophically, this creates a really interesting dilemma. From a purely self-interested standpoint, Bob's best strategy is to hope that Sally contributes enough to fund the station on her own. That way, he gets to enjoy the radio without spending any of his own money.
Right. And of course, Sally is thinking the exact same thing.
Exactly. And if they both follow that logic, neither contributes, and the radio station never gets built. So even though they'd both be better off if they cooperated and both contributed, the individual incentive is to try to free ride, which could lead to a worse outcome for everyone.
It's like a classic prisoner's dilemma scenario. They could both benefit from cooperation, but self-interest leads them to a suboptimal outcome.
Exactly. And this, I think, really gets to the heart of the public goods problem and its philosophical implications. It challenges this idea that individual rationality will always lead to the best results for society.
Right. Sometimes it's in our collective interest to do things that aren't necessarily in our immediate individual interest.
Exactly. And if everyone is always trying to free ride and avoid contributing to public goods, then all sorts of essential services and resources could be undersupplied or disappear entirely.
So what are some of the ways that philosophers and economists have thought about addressing this problem?
Well, one of the classic responses, going back to thinkers like Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill, is government provision.
Government steps in where the market fails.
Right. The idea is that when private incentives are insufficient to produce a public good, the state has a legitimate role in stepping in to ensure its provision, even if that means using coercive measures like taxation.
And the philosophical justification for that is?
It rests on the idea that the state has a responsibility to promote the common good, and that sometimes that requires overriding individual self-interest for the benefit of all. It's tied to this notion of a social contract. We give up some individual freedom in exchange for the benefits of living in a society where the state provides certain essential goods and services.
But the encyclopedia also points out that there are philosophical challenges to government provision, too.
Or for sure, it's not a perfect solution. Like one issue is, how do you actually determine how much of a public good to provide and how much people are willing to pay for it?
Yeah, how do you figure out what people actually want and how much they value it?
Right. And the problem is that if the government tries to assess people's preferences, individuals have an incentive to understate how much they truly value the good because they'd rather have someone else foot the bill.
It's that free rider impulse again, trying to get something for less than it's worth to you.
Exactly. And this leads to debates about how to get people to reveal their true preferences and design fair and efficient ways to fund public goods. Like there's this idea of Lindell taxes where everyone would be taxed according to the benefit they receive, but it's practically impossible to implement because you can't really know everyone's true valuation.
Right. It's a nice idea in theory, but very messy in practice. The encyclopedia also mentions Leif Johansson's argument that the free rider problem might not be as universal or insurmountable as some economic models suggest.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Johansson looked at real-world behavior and found that people do contribute to public goods voluntarily in many cases. He pointed to things like voter turnout and charitable giving, things that traditional free rider theory would have trouble explaining.
So maybe we're not all just purely self-interested rational actors after all.
Right. Maybe there are other motivations at play. A sense of civic duty, altruism, a desire to be part of something larger than ourselves.
So if the government isn't always the answer, what about private provision of public goods? The encyclopedia has a whole section on that.
Yeah, and Mann-Carlson's work is really central here. He argues that organizations, by their very nature, often end up providing public goods as a byproduct of their activities. He also talks about the idea of coupling private and public goods as a way to overcome the free rider problem.
The lighthouse financed by port dues is the classic example there.
Exactly. By tying the benefit of the lighthouse, which is a public good, to a private transaction using the port, they create a funding mechanism that doesn't rely on voluntary contributions.
Right. They're essentially bundling a public good with a private good, but does that always work?
Well, that's where some of the philosophical concerns come in. Like, one problem is that it could exclude people who can't afford the associated private good. The encyclopedia uses the example of competing shopping centers. If one shopping center offers free parking to attract customers, a competitor might choose not to offer that amenity and instead offer lower prices. So in the end, if consumers are primarily driven by price, the public good in this case, free parking, might disappear even though it's something people value.
So it's not a foolproof solution. What other mechanisms does the encyclopedia talk about?
Well, beyond that kind of coupling, there's the role of non-self-interested behavior. Things like altruism and philanthropy. People do donate to charities and contribute to community initiatives, even when they don't get a direct, tangible benefit.
Right. It suggests that maybe the purely rational self-interest model isn't always accurate.
Exactly. And then there's the incredibly powerful influence of social norms. Things like shared understandings of fairness, reciprocity, or even just the fear of social disapproval can motivate people to act in ways that benefit the collective, even without any formal enforcement.
The example they give is littering. Like, there's a social norm against littering that helps keep public spaces cleaner, even if there aren't always strict penalties for doing it.
Exactly. And that suggests that social and ethical norms play a huge role in the provision of public goods, even if it's not always conscious or deliberate.
The encyclopedia also gets into some of the empirical research on this, talking about public goods games.
Yes.
So what can we learn from those experiments?
I think they offer really valuable insights into human behavior in situations where there's a tension between individual self-interest and collective benefit. They often find this pattern of initial overcontribution and decay in these games. Like, people are initially willing to contribute to the public good, but over time, as they see others free riding, their contributions dwindle.
So it's like our cooperative instincts are strong, but they can be eroded if we don't see others reciprocating.
Yeah. It's like we need some assurance that others are pulling their weight too.
And the encyclopedia talks about John Elster's different types of cooperative behavior. How does that fit into all of this?
Well, Elster's work, I think, helps us move beyond this simple binary of self-interest versus altruism. He suggests there's a whole spectrum of motivations that can drive cooperative behavior.
I see.
Like you have full utilitarians who are trying to maximize the overall good, selfless utilitarians who prioritize others' well-being, people who are unconditional cooperators, and those who are motivated by fairness or social norms. Recognizing this variety of motivations is, I think, really important for understanding how to encourage cooperation in the real world.
So it's not just about convincing people to be less selfish, it's about understanding the different reasons why people cooperate and tapping into those.
Exactly.
And the encyclopedia also points out that things like communication and how the payoffs are structured can influence contributions in these games.
Yeah, which again suggests that the design of our social and economic systems can make a big difference. Like just allowing communication between participants in these games often leads to much higher levels of cooperation. It's like building trust and understanding makes a big difference.
So it's not just about setting the right incentives, it's about creating the conditions for trust and collaboration.
Right. And beyond the lab, the encyclopedia also looks at field studies and real-world examples, which I think are really valuable because they show us how this stuff actually plays out in more complex contexts.
Yeah, it's one thing to see it in a controlled experiment, but it's another to see it in the messy reality of everyday life.
Exactly. And these studies shed light on questions like whether private and public contributions are substitutes or complements.
Like, does government funding crowd out private initiatives, or can they work together?
Right. And the evidence often suggests that it's not as simple either. They also look at historical case studies, like Kawasi's work on lighthouses, which actually challenges the assumption that government provision is always necessary.
Right, he found that lots of lighthouses were privately funded and operated.
Exactly. So again, I think it encourages us to be cautious about making generalizations and to really pay attention to the specific context.
Okay, so this brings us to the final section of the encyclopedia entry, which is on the ethics of public goods, specifically focusing on the arguments surrounding government funding. And it starts by noting that the argument for government funding seems pretty straightforward on the surface.
Yeah. Like if something benefits everyone, it makes sense for the government to provide it.
But the encyclopedia argues that there are actually some pretty weighty philosophical assumptions hidden beneath that seemingly simple argument.
Right. And I think a lot of these assumptions stem from the field of welfare economics, which often tries to make judgments about what's best for society as a whole.
And one of the big ones is the assumption that satisfying people's preferences is the same as increasing their well-being.
Exactly. But philosophers have pointed out that this isn't always the case. People can have preferences that are inconsistent or uninformed, or they might even have preferences that are harmful to themselves or others. So simply fulfilling whatever desires people happen to have doesn't necessarily lead to a good outcome.
It raises the question of whether the government should always try to cater to what people say they want, or if there's a role for shaping those preferences or promoting certain values.
Right. And that gets into some really tricky philosophical territory.
Another challenge the encyclopedia brings up is the difficulty of making interpersonal comparisons of utility.
Yes, that's a big one. How do you actually compare the benefit one person gets from a public good to the cost or benefit someone else experiences? Like, is there an objective way to say that this person's benefit is greater than that person's cost?
It seems like those judgments would always be subjective to some extent.
Right, and that makes it really hard to justify government intervention based on some notion of maximizing overall welfare.
Because you can't really know if you're making things better or worse overall.
Exactly, and the encyclopedia talks about some of the economic tools that have been developed to try to get around this, like Pareto and Hicks-Kaldor improvements. But those have limitations too.
They work best in situations where you can make at least one person better off without making anyone else worse off, but that's not always possible.
Right. Most policy decisions are going to create winners and losers, which forces us to grapple with questions of fairness and justice that go beyond just trying to maximize some abstract notion of total welfare.
The encyclopedia also brings up the concern about paternalism. Even when the government is trying to provide things that are widely considered good, it still involves a level of coercion.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Even if we assume that the government is acting with good intentions, there's still a question of whether it's justified in forcing people to contribute to things they might not individually value. And that can get particularly tricky when you're dealing with things like public goods, where the benefits are often diffuse and hard to measure.
It raises questions about individual liberty and the limits of state power. Like, at what point does promoting the common good become an infringement on individual autonomy?
Right. And those are questions that philosophers have been debating for centuries.
And then there's the issue of fairness and inequality, which comes up a lot when we're talking about public goods.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Even if a public good is technically available to everyone, that doesn't mean everyone benefits equally. And in some cases, public goods might actually exacerbate existing inequalities or disproportionately benefit certain groups.
Like, if a public park is built in a wealthy neighborhood, it's technically open to everyone, but it's likely to be used mostly by the people who live nearby.
Exactly. And I think that raises important questions about how to ensure that public goods are truly serving the common good in a way that's fair and just.
The encyclopedia also presents Friedrich Hayek's argument in favor of the market, emphasizing its role as a discovery process.
Right. Hayek's argument was that the price system in a market economy does a really good job of conveying information about what people want and how much they value it. It helps allocate resources efficiently. But when the government steps in and starts providing goods and services directly, that information flow gets disrupted, which can lead to inefficiencies.
So he's saying that the market is better at figuring out what people actually want and need than the government is.
Exactly. And philosophically, this ties into a broader argument about the benefits of decentralized decision-making.
Right, leaving things up to individuals to figure out rather than having a central authority dictating everything.
Exactly.
And finally, the encyclopedia explores arguments for limiting the market when it comes to certain goods, drawing on thinkers like Michael Walzer and Elizabeth Anderson.
Yeah. And Anderson in particular makes this compelling argument that some goods, often ones we consider public goods, should be governed by non-market norms. She talks about things like roads, parks, and education as political goods that are essential for democratic citizenship.
So things that shouldn't be bought and sold or subject to market logic.
Right. She argues that market norms, with their emphasis on self-interest and competition, can undermine the values of democratic citizenship, which rely on things like equality, solidarity, and collective decision-making.
So providing those goods through democratic means, rather than through the market, helps strengthen our sense of shared civic identity.
Exactly. And I think Kohlhoff's ideas about central goods, connectivity goods, and identification goods really resonate with this perspective. He emphasizes how certain public goods act as symbols of our shared identity and help create a sense of belonging to a larger community.
So it's not just about the material benefits they provide, it's about their symbolic importance and their role in shaping our sense of who we are as a society.
Absolutely. I think that's a really powerful point.
Well, this has been a pretty deep dive into the philosophy of public goods. I think we've covered a lot of ground.
We really have. From the basic economic definitions to the ethical dilemmas to the real-world challenges of provision.
And it really is remarkable how a concept that seems so straightforward on the surface can open up all these incredibly complex and nuanced questions about how we live together.
I completely agree. It's one of those ideas that just keeps unfolding the more you think about it.
So for you listening, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you consider to be the essential public goods for a flourishing society? And how do we balance individual liberty with the need for collective action when it comes to providing those goods? This exploration of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on Public Goods has hopefully given you some new food for thought. And we encourage you to keep exploring these ideas and grappling with these questions because they're ultimately at the heart of what it means to live in a just and equitable society.